So the paper will be somewhere around behind the distribution. All right, the next speaker up will be Dr. David Evans from Australia. He was formerly of the Australian Greenhouse Office, now I guess the Department of Climate Science or Climate Change in Australia. It's amazing to have a government that have that kind of office. Professor Dr. Evans has a lot of degrees, and his background is in mathematics, computing, and electrical engineering. He has a PhD from electrical engineering from Stanford University. And today he'll be telling us about carbon dioxide not responsible for the 20th century warming.
Hi, I want to talk about signatures and the hotspot. I want to make this as sort of simple and accessible as possible so that the general public can get to this. Hi. I have to bend over. I want to make this talk as simple and accessible as possible. I want to talk about hotspots and signatures. Warming signatures are really important. Unfortunately, most global warming debating points don't really matter very much. For example, whether the receding snowline on Mount Kilimanjaro is due to global warming or local deforestation, reducing the rainfall, has never really converted anyone between alarmism and scepticism. And it certainly has no bearing on what the cause of global warming is, or whether we should have a carbon tax. Signatures, however, are different. They give evidence about causes, they can rule out some causes, and they can confirm or falsify the IPCC climate models quickly and definitively. If the alarmists lose this argument over signatures, they lose the whole ballgame. We win. Almost no one knows about signatures. AGW proponents have kept very quiet about them. They never want to talk about them. The main information was collected by 1999. By about 2003, I believe, we got the earliest technical publications, and it wasn't until about 2007 that I first saw any sort of public outing of this information. I've never seen it published in the mainstream media, yet the signature information is second only to the temperature information in proving or disproving AGW. Temperature information, however, is going to take a couple of decades to play out as we see your predictions come true. However, on the other hand, if signatures had confirmed the IPCC models, I'm sure we would have heard all about it in the media, and every two-bit science journalist would be an expert on signatures. Causes leave clues. Each possible cause of global warming heats up the atmosphere in a distinctive pattern. Its signature, just like fingerprints. Here's the data. This is the observed warming pattern from the last period of warming. The last period of warming went from about 77 to about 2001, give or take. This catches 20 years right in the middle of it. This is radiosonde data. This was published, as far as I know, the first time it was published and made available to the public in the US Climate Change Science Program, and they published it in a small diagram buried near the back of a report in amongst some theoretical diagrams in 2006. Remember, this was collected by 1999. This is radiosonde data. The axis on the bottom of it goes across from 75 north through the equator, 75 south. On the vertical axis, if you look over on the right-hand side, goes from the surface up to about 24 kilometres. And what you see is that we've had broad stratospheric cooling, we've had broad tropospheric warming, but I draw your attention to the big arrow in the middle that's pointing at the middle, and there's no region of heating around the middle at the top of the troposphere. There's no hotspot. The hotspot refers to the region at the top of the troposphere in the tropics, and that's the region that should show increased heating if AGW is correct. That's really all the data we have. We can't collect any more data on warming until there's another warming period, which may not be for another 30 years. We didn't have radiosondes going up in the warming period prior to this one, which ended in 1940. So that's pretty much it. Now, you can process the raw radiosonde data in different ways, so people will come up with slightly different data sets, but that's basically it. Here are the signatures from the most authoritative source, AR4. Now remember, signatures are always theoretical. These are calculated by the IPCC's climate models, and this is the famous picture they produced. They produced 5 signatures in diagrams A through E, and the sum of signatures in diagram F. I draw your attention to C, which is what the IPCC models say should happen if there's an increase in non-water vapour greenhouse gases. Notice the 3 features. You have tropospheric cooling, stratospheric cooling, tropospheric warming, and a big hotspot. Because, in the IPCC's opinion, the greenhouse gas increase dominates the global warming, when they add together the 5 causes, the 5 signatures they know about, and make a combined one, the greenhouse gas signature dominates the total picture down there in F. Sorry, I forgot to draw your attention. They inconveniently gave us a picture, as they saw it, from 1890 through 1999, 109 years, of which we only have observed data for the last 20, so it's a little bit hard to compare. However, the good old US climate science program did a similar exercise, and they did it from 1958 to 1999. The extra good thing about that is that from 1958 through to 1978, there was very little warming or cooling, so it really didn't make much difference. So this, which has all the same structural features as the IPCC diagrams in AR4, this is directly comparable with the observed data I showed you before. We don't know the signature, I don't know the signatures of ocean oscillations or cosmic rays, so we can't, from the observed signatures, work out exactly what's going on, but we can rule out some things. First conclusion you can draw, AGW is wrong. On the left is the observed data, on the right is the predicted data. AGW predicts a hotspot, unambiguously. The data shows there is no hotspot, fairly unambiguously, so AGW is wrong. What more do you need to know? That took 5 minutes to get to here. And I think most people with a reasonable education, not a science education, just a reasonable education, would follow that argument. Yet I have never seen that in the press. Conclusion 2. Let's compare the observed warming with what the IPCC models say is the signature or fingerprint of warming due to increased CO2. They look completely different. Again, one has a hotspot and the other doesn't. I've got to be a bit tricky about the conclusion. To the extent that climate theory is correct and that is the signature of CO2 warming, then carbon is innocent. Of course, the IPCC models might be so broken that the signature might be something entirely different, in which case we can't draw that conclusion. So what does the IPCC do about this apart from keeping really quiet about the issue? They're in a spot of trouble. The signature information kills AGW, and it undermines the theory that carbon emissions cause global warming. Now, the usual practice when theory disagrees with data is to modify the theory. For obvious reasons, that's not going to happen here. Instead, the IPCC chose to attack the data and keep the theory without modification. We've got 2 main lines of attack. First was by Ben Santer. He looked at the radiosonde data, and there's uncertainties. He stretched the error bars. Then he mounted a complex statistical argument that the hotspot might be there, hidden amongst the noise, but we couldn't detect it. All right. While an individual radiosonde might miss the hotspot, collectively, hundreds of them couldn't. If a radiosonde is calibrated and operated correctly, it'll detect a temperature difference of about 0.1 degree. And the hotspot we're looking for is probably greater than 0.6 of a degree. Steve Sherwood is another IPCC scientist. He had another line of attack. He said, let's throw away the radiosonde thermometer data And instead, we'll look at the drift of the balloons to work out what was happening in the wind, essentially have a wind gauge on the radiosondes instead. When he then takes those data and a theory about wind shear and he analyses the data on his computers, he says you can't rule out the presence of a hotspot. Steve, thermometers are designed to measure temperature, and you're trying to tell us that your wind estimations are accidentally better at measuring temperatures than the thermometers on the radiosondes. Well, look, it's fair enough that we get the best arguments from everyone and that the IPCC put up their best arguments, but their objections are plainly weak. If they claim there's a hotspot and the rest of it's noise, where's the hotspot? There should be some trace of it. So the obvious conclusion is simply that there was an increased greenhouse effect due to rising CO2 levels. For theoretical reasons, we believe that. But its effect was so small that the hotspot was not detectable by the technology we had deployed in the 1980s and 90s. The obvious answer is that something else was causing global warming, and it overwhelmed the small signature from CO2. The key question in all this is not whether CO2 raises the temperature. Every molecule of CO2 that we emit raises global temperature. But the question is, how much? The answer from the signatures seems to be somewhere between undetectable and barely significant. Now, let's get into the heart of AGW. This is fairly important. The hotspot is not just some peripheral feature that can be discarded. It is an intrinsic, inherent feature of the AGW theory. You can't get around it. It's at the heart of AGW. What climate theory, as espoused by the IPCC, says is that any heating of the Earth's surface causes a hotspot due to water vapour feedback. An increase in surface temperature increases ocean evaporation, which increases water vapour in the atmosphere. Water vapour is a greenhouse gas, so it joins the other greenhouse gases in the troposphere, increases the greenhouse effect, and it enlarges the troposphere. This pushes the warmer troposphere up into space previously occupied by the stratosphere. So there is a volume of space that was previously in the stratosphere. Because the troposphere enlarged, that volume of space is now hidden below the top of the blanket of the troposphere, so it's going to get a little bit hotter. That's the essence of the hotspot. This is a simple talk, so I won't mention lapse rates, but they're important. But don't change the picture at all. Just to make sure that point's well understood, these are a couple of theoretical signals from the GISS model. The one on the left is from what happens when you double CO2 levels, and they reckon if you increase the solar radiation by 2%, you get one on the right. Both of those are almost identical. The signature is dominated by the hotspot. Now, in IPCC climate theory, the water vapour feedback amplifies any surface warming at least twofold. I didn't bring my supercomputer, so I'm going to use a sort of really simple method of calculating to show you how important it is. Journalist Christopher Monckton has heroically pieced together the most recent published information about what the IPCC thinks in a fairly simple system diagram. There it is. He put that up in a controversial paper on the American Physics Society. Due to time constraints, we won't go into all the gory details, and we'll just start skipping a few things. But if you put let's go on a little bit. On the left-hand side, you've got a forcing dF, a forcing perturbation. It goes through that green box, which is what happens if there's no feedbacks, and it produces a perturbation in temperature dt. That perturbation in temperature feeds back through the purple box to the temperature feedbacks, which then exhibits themselves as another forcing perturbation. You solve all the simultaneous equations and all that stuff, and you get that equation dt equals kappa df over 1 minus b kappa. Now, the IPCC is, with Monckton's help, has essentially supplied information about what the values of all these feedbacks are. If you plug in all the IPCC values for all the things that Monckton's outlined there, you get for a CO2 doubling, you get a change in temperature, an increase in temperature of about 3.3 degrees, which is exactly what the IPCC models say. So we're in the right ballpark using this simplified approach. Now I'm going to lower the water feedback, the water vapour feedback. Instead of using the value of 1.8 up there, I'm going to change it to 0.2, and I'm going to halve the lapse rate which is associated with it. Put those numbers in and leave all the other exaggerations in the IPCC models in place, and their predicted temperature rise for a doubling of CO2 drops to 1.5 degrees. And you can play around with those numbers, and in particular I draw your attention to the fact that some of the scientists here at this meeting reckon that water vapour feedback is in fact probably negative, so I may be being a bit too generous there. The essential point is that the IPCC, for obvious political reasons, is very reluctant to turn down the water vapour feedback. Because if they turn down the water vapour feedback enough so that there's not much of a hotspot, their temperature predictions drop by more than half. So the carbon scare doesn't seem nearly as scary, and they'll lose their jobs. It also has a side effect, by the way, if you turn down the water vapour feedback, of making the climate models much more stable. As it is, they're pretty close to a tipping point, but if you turn down the water vapour feedback, they become much more stable and in line with the Earth's history. So where does this leave us? What's next with the signature information? Probably nothing. The problem's been known about for years. Fred Singer's been banging on about it since 1995. Press won't touch it. Even most skeptics don't understand it and don't understand the significance of it. This is the weapon you can use to defeat AGW. Maybe the alarmist scientists will say, well, let's turn down the water vapour feedback and the temperature rises won't be so bad. So let's see, they'll lose their funding, their jobs and their status. Been involved in this debate from both sides. As I was introduced, I worked for the Department of Climate Change in Australia. So I mix with people on the other side of things regularly and I get paychecks. I used to be on the other side. I understand what's going on, at least in a broad sociological sense. The science was always fairly irrelevant. AGW was always promoted primarily by politics. You had an inner group of 45 who peer-reviewed each other's papers. You had a tidal wave of government money that supported AGW. You had a vice president who went around sacking people who didn't, in the US science establishment, who didn't agree with AGW. If CO2 caused global warming, there should be a correlation between CO2 and temperature. There is one on the timescale of thousands of years in the old ice core data, but as we know, the lags are the wrong way around. There's no correlation on a million-year timescale, and the correlation on a tens-of-year timescale is very weak. So why anyone would ever believe that CO2 caused global warming is a little bit beyond me. The only evidence, and I don't mean computer models. Computer models are just a series of calculations you can do in a hand calculator. They're not evidence. I'm a modeler. Don't trust models. The only evidence we ever had was the old ice core data, and that reversed itself in 2000. But here's the crucial political point. By 1998, we already had the Kyoto Protocol. We had a bureaucracy in all the major Western countries dealing with this problem, and we had a roadmap towards carbon emission trading by 2010. The ice core data reversed itself definitively by 2003. That was ignored, even in Al Gore's 2005 movie. Al Gore misled us about the ice core data in 2005, and not a single journalist I've ever seen corrected him in the mainstream press. The missing hotspot contradicts AGW. That's ignored. The case that carbon emissions cause global warming is laughably weak. There just isn't any evidence. So, what's going on? This is what they teach in journalism. Follow the money. Skeptics and big oil, us. They spend about $2 million a year on us. Big government and the Greens, about $2 billion. We're outgunned 1,000 to 1. That's not what's going on. The finance industry, 120 billion traded last year, and that number is exploding. You haven't even got cap and trade here or in my country yet. Now, the finance industry doesn't pocket that whole 120 billion, and I probably only used to keep a couple of % of it in fees, but a couple of % of 120 billion is getting bigger than those other figures, and it's only going to expand. This question goes back to the Romans. Who benefits? Now, emission permits are created by fiat out of thin air, yet they have no value. Trading favours the well-informed and those who can move markets. Big financial firms routinely plunder the pockets of others. You can rest assured that one way or another, the rest of us are going to pay not only for the carbon permits, but we're going to pay for the trading profits of those companies as well. Let me give you a big picture. The whole global warming argument fits into a much larger context of a struggle that's been going on for several centuries. 1694, we had an emergency in England, and they instituted the Bank of England to introduce fractional reserve banking. In fractional reserve banking, bankers get to create bank money out of thin air. They take a amount of base money, they multiply it up by 10, they take that money and they let you borrow it at an interest rate. In 1971, we switched our base money from gold to fiat currency. Again, you just create it out of thin air. 2010, we'll introduce carbon trading. Again, you get emission permits. Essential features are you create it out of thin air. It's valuable. Other people who work for a living have to buy it. We don't need any of these things. They were all introduced in emergencies. Who remembers the emergency of 1694 that finally overturned the European ban on fractional reserve banking that had been in place for centuries? No one. It'll be the same with this. We'll have those three rods on our back as a society forever. Apparently I've run out of time, so that's it.